I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically, the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count. Hungary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was never a successful communist state.
Sorry, I want to replay this point, or replay this part.
Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So you almost got to wonder if that part's like a joke. I know it's not a joke. I know he's serious because he takes himself so seriously despite his scholarship being so unserious. But he mentions the DPRK, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Okay, after becoming communist, the US killed 20% of the DPRK's population and leveled every building over 2 stories tall. There were members of the US military who were switching sides and going to fight for Korea because they recognized that they were the bad guys. And that 20% of Korea's population statistic comes from a US Air Force General, Curtis LeMay. And a lot of what we know about Korea comes from former US military. One of them said that the pilots, the US pilots, were complaining that they didn't have any targets left to bomb because they had carpet bombed the country so thoroughly, destroyed all of their infrastructure and leveled every building over 2 stories tall while killing 20% of the people, 1 person in every family of 5, that they didn't have any targets left to hit. So that's Korea, the DPRK. Is that a failure of communism? Is that how communism fails? It attracts the US and gets the US to murder 20% of your population, 1/5 of your population. That sounds like an issue with capitalism. That sounds like an evil of capitalism. That sounds like more of a reason to get rid of capitalism. Or what about the killing fields in Cambodia? You mean Pol Pot, who was backed by the CIA? Pol Pot, who said that he didn't understand Marxism? Pol Pot, who was eventually taken out by the Vietnamese communists, despite, unfortunately being backed by China, or being supported by China, which is one of the foreign policy mistakes of China. But then Henry Kissinger, not only did the US back Pol Pot, but Henry Kissinger committed genocide in Cambodia. He told the military, anything that moves or flies, hit, kill it. And millions were killed, which is why Anthony Bourdain, the late Anthony Bourdain, said before he died, after you've been Kissinger to death with your bare hands, because of the amount of pain and suffering that Henry Kissinger, who supported capitalism, was a puppet of the Western finance capitalists, not communists, because of the devastation that he enacted on their country and the millions he killed, the millions of people who were left without family members, or who starved in the aftermath because their infrastructure was destroyed by US bombs. But yes, this proves that communism could never work because Pol Pot called himself a communist while getting CIA money. And then he says Vietnam, too. Peterson mentions Vietnam, the DPRK, Cambodia, and Vietnam. That's proof that communism doesn't work. Like, do I even have to say anything about Vietnam? Do I really? Can everyone just watch the movie Platoon? Right? And see how Oliver Stone's movie Platoon about Vietnam, where the soldiers realize that they're the bad guys and how senseless this war is. And how, millions of people are being left with trauma, PTSD, because they're watching the most horrific things happen. A movie that portrays the US massacres where they went into civilian areas and just murdered people. A war where the US dropped thousands and thousands of tons of Agent Orange and napalm on this country who never attacked us. Yeah, that shows the failure of communism. And he said there's never been a successful communist state. Like, JP, Vietnam won that war, right? Even with all of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, the DPRK and Vietnam still beat back the US. Another dub for communism.
It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically, the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count. So then the first question was, well, are these Marxists motivated by love or hatred?
Well, I think the Marxists in Vietnam and Korea were motivated by sovereignty, by having political and economic control and independence of their own country. They had both been colonized for years by the Japanese and the French, and they overthrew those colonizers and were quickly invaded by the US, who tried to seize those colonies. So at first they were motivated by independence, sovereignty, which is something that the US claims to believe in, which is why Vietnamese Communist leader Ho Chi Minh, when they were waging their independence struggle against the French, read the US Constitution and asked the US for help, said the US supports freedom and democracy, you should support our struggle, which is when the US invaded and killed millions of people with bombs. But I imagine these Marxists in Korea and Vietnam were motivated by hatred after the US bombing campaigns and civilian massacres against their people and the destruction of their infrastructure and the lies that the US told to justify all this horrendous, just absurd murder and destruction that they enforced their own system without having millions of their people killed with bombs. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of them were motivated by hatred, and that's probably why they were able to hold on to their sovereignty, even though, in Korea, 20% of their population was killed. Or in Vietnam, the soil today is still messed up from the tons of Agent Orange and napalm and deadly chemicals launched on their people. Yeah, I'm sure they started hating the US after that, and they said, we're going to dig our heels in and not give up our homeland to these imperialist invading colonizers. I'm sure they were motivated by love in some ways too, but...
Is it love or hatred that produces 100 million dead people? And is that enough evidence or not? And if it's not enough evidence, if you think to yourself, well, that's not enough evidence, it was never really given a proper try. It's like, well, what would have been a proper try? See, I always think when I hear someone say that, I know what you think. You think in your delusional arrogance that you understand the Marxist doctrines better than anyone else ever has, and that if you were the one implementing those doctrines, you would have ushered in the utopia. That's what you mean when you say that. And
no, Jordan, it's the exact opposite. You are projecting the character trait of delusional arrogance. You are so delusional and so arrogant, or so paid off by libertarian right-wing NGOs to give these shitty speeches, to listen to anyone else, to listen to any actual historians, to engage with any actual historical analyses. So you just give these death counts, these death numbers in countries like Vietnam, Korea, and Cambodia, where the US has killed far more people than any communist. You give these death counts and say, is that not enough evidence? No, because you're not actually giving any evidence. You're just listing the amount of people who died, right? Which everyone dies. And if you tallied up the amount of death inflicted by capitalism through various means, it would be way, 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 way higher, especially in these specific countries that you mentioned. So then you talk so condescendingly towards, you're all just delusional and arrogant because you criticize the current system. You're delusional and arrogant. You think you know everything about every field of academia and you can speak confidently on it, but despite being a behavioral psychologist, when you have a childish grasp on history in other fields related to history and social sciences. So all you can do is just cherry pick unscholarly work, which you're too lazy to figure out is actually unscholarly work. You're too lazy to look into the criticisms of the Black Book of Communism and these books that you love. So in your delusional arrogance, you talk down on anybody who criticizes capitalism like they're morons and you've got it all figured out. I've never seen a better example of projection. It's crazy. I mean, I've spent countless hours researching this stuff. I've spent countless hours researching socialism and existing socialism and trying to figure out exactly what was going on and whether or not people like you were lying to me. Right? But you just skim the numbers, just Google the numbers in the Black Book of Communism and think you got it all figured out. How arrogant are you? How is there any scholarly or intellectual rigor in your brain at all, right? Is there any self-questioning or self-criticism at all Or do you just Google stats that meet your narrative and then, profess them as if they're truth and say anybody who disagrees with the conclusions that you drew from those stats is just delusional and arrogant? Like, fuck you. You are the most delusional and arrogant scholar I've ever seen in my life. It's all projection. It's all projection. Like, him talking about all the people killed in Vietnam, Cambodia, and the DPRK, it's all projection of what capitalism's done, right? And when he calls Marxists delusional and arrogant for wanting to look at things in their historical context, it's all projection. He knows he's delusional and arrogant, and he's got to put it on other people. And as a psychologist, you'd think he'd know that. You think he'd know about the psychological phenomena that is projection.
They say, and there's an idea in the New Testament that there's a sin, it's the sin against the Holy Ghost. If you commit that sin, no one really knows what it is, that you can't be forgiven. And I would say, well, if you want a candidate for the sin against the Holy Ghost in the 21st century, the statement, real communism was never tried, with the underlying idea that if you had been the person implementing it, it would have worked, I think that's a pretty good contender for something for which you should never be forgiven.
God, could he be any more dramatic? Could he be any more dramatic? You've sinned against the Holy Ghost for supporting socialism, and you can never be forgiven. And then they laugh at him, and he walks back behind the podium like dead ass serious. Like, calm down, dude. You just said a bunch of nonsense. You didn't say anything that deep, right? This isn't a mic drop moment. Everything you just said was stupid. But I'm sorry, guys. I can't support communism anymore. I can't do it. Marx failed to consider that communism is a sin against the Holy Ghost. I didn't realize that. I hadn't realized I sinned against the ghosts. My bad. I don't like communism anymore. Capitalism's the way to go. We all failed to consider the Holy Ghost. I thank you for giving us an example, another example of why Marx was right, Jordan. Religion is not just an opium of the masses, but a tool for reinforcing the existing relations of production. Right? If you go against the existing relations of production between capitalist and wage labor, if you go against capitalism, you're sinning against the Holy Ghost, which is unforgivable. You're being irreligious. You're doing the worst thing you could possibly do. Which, sounds a lot like the divine right of kings during the era of feudalism when they had monarchs, like in pre-revolutionary Russia. Right? We can't change anything. We can't do anything different. We can't move towards capitalism. Don't you know about the divine right of kings? The kings have been appointed by God as our authority. We can't question it. And if we do, it's unforgivable. You've sinned against the Holy Ghost. Yeah, okay. I'm good. I'm good on that. I'm tired of seeing millions of people die in wars and die of starvation and die because they don't have health care and die because there's an opioid crisis created by for-profit pharmaceutical companies. I don't think it's a sin against the Holy Ghost to be against that stuff. And also, a lot of the Marxists nowadays don't say, Marxism's failed every time it's been tried, but let me try it. A lot of us Marxists today think that's pretty dumb, and the people who say that are being silly, right? But what we actually do is stop just taking historians like you in the Black Book of Communism at their word, historians like Jordan Peterson, who's not even a historian, he's a psychologist, and we've started actually looking into the historical evidence of what happened in these areas, right? What happened in these countries where apparently Mao and Stalin were just massacring people for no reason. And we found that, the reason that you, Peterson, and the Black Book of Communism try and isolate historical events where people died is so that they can find a way to blame any death they can on socialism without ever discussing any of the gains of socialism, right? One of the funniest things Peterson says in that lecture, that nonsensical lecture, is, millions of people died, 100 million people or whatever. 100 million is the number that the one Black Book of Communism author was obsessed with reaching. So Peterson says, is that not enough evidence for you? Like, of course that's not enough evidence. That's one data point. You've given me one statistic, number of deaths, right? Which there's going to be a lot of deaths in every country because humans are mortal and we all die. right? So I'm going to need a little bit more than the number of deaths, right? Especially when you're talking about the collectivization process in the USSR and China, right? Compare the Peterson's analysis where he lists one statistic to a dialectical materialist analysis that looks at production and the development of production over time and how that affects the superstructure, how that affects the politics. All right, you'll see that the education system was expanded greatly. The healthcare system was expanded greatly because the productive base was industrialized. They moved towards machine production, and they moved out of these feudal relations of production where people were dominated by monarchs and landlords. They taught their entire country to read. They were able to defeat the Nazis. Like we said, there were all these gains that were made because of the productive advancements that are just completely ignored, never even discussed, never even brought into the conversation by Peterson, right? He just isolates the number of deaths as the only statistic and then says, is that not enough evidence for you? Like, no, dumbass. And that shouldn't be enough evidence for you if you were actually a real scholar and not a goon paid off by libertarian think tanks to spit nonsense. Is that not enough evidence for you? This one statistic? No, you dipshit. Why would that be enough evidence? Why would one statistic isolating deaths be enough evidence for any historian worth their salt? Especially if, you consider the deaths created by capitalism, even from things that Americans consider to be good, right? Like I said, a lot of the times they'll count the deaths of revolution in China and Russia as deaths that happened during the Civil War that followed the revolution, or deaths that happened during the revolution, or deaths that happened when the USSR was defending themselves from the Nazis. Those are blamed on communism. Okay, well, let's use those same metrics then for the US. Are all the deaths caused by the US during the World War II, both of our own citizens and others in the countries we're fighting, are those victims of capitalism? I mean, they actually are, because World War II was a capitalist imperialist war ultimately. But were the people killed in defeating the Nazis deaths of capitalism that prove our economic system could never work? Right? Or what about the Revolutionary War in the United States? What about the people killed by General George Washington? Is he a general or what? I don't know. What about the people killed by the revolutionary forces in the US? Right? Are all those people victims of capitalism, Jordan Peterson? Or how about the Civil War? Right? How about the Civil War when the northern industrial capitalists were drawn into a class conflict with the southern slave owners? Right? The Civil War is considered by Americans to be a liberating thing. It ended slavery. Right? We had to fight a war for it, but we ended the slave mode of production and moved towards a capitalist mode of production, freed the slaves. Right? Are all of those deaths of capitalism? Could I just tally up the amount of people who died in the Civil War, call it deaths of capitalism, and say, isn't that enough evidence for you? Isn't this enough evidence that capitalism could never work? Kermit the Frog. You see how stupid the method of analysis that he uses and that the Black Book of Communism uses is if you put the shoe on the other foot, right? If you try and look at the US and these events that are considered progressive in our country's history, but were violent, were events where different economic classes were drawn into conflict, and just say this is proof that a certain economic system doesn't work. It's insane. It's literally insane. And of course, he doesn't ever talk about the deaths of starvation, the deaths due to lack of infrastructure, malnutrition, the various deaths that happen every day under capitalism because of how capitalist production is managed. Doesn't mention the 40,000 people who die every year in the US, the wealthiest country on earth, because they don't have health care, right? Or all the people who died like that in Cuba before the revolution brought health care to everyone in all the rural areas. 100 rural hospitals have shut down in the US, well over 100 rural hospitals in the past 10 years alone, right? So we can't even bring health care to people here 40,000 people are dying because they don't have health care every year, while 100,000 are dying because they're victims of the opioid crisis created by for-profit pharmaceutical companies, right? But that's not evidence that capitalism doesn't work. Only people who died in 1930s Russia due to a famine caused by weather conditions. And that proves socialism doesn't work. Can't apply the same logic to capitalism, though. Otherwise, it might go against our narrative. Friggin', what a video. What a video. I'm going to have to cut that into parts. What makes me so mad about it is what I said repeatedly during that segment. The fact that he's considered like one of the great academics in America. He's considered one of our society's like smartest public intellectuals. And as someone involved in academia who actually does try and have, intellectual or scholarly rigor, who does actually try and get to the bottom of things and not talk out my ass about things, it's insane and frustrating to watch someone who's making millions of dollars with, not even a fraction of the scholarly rigor, with no scholarly rigor to speak of, just pulling things out of his ass and throwing them to the libertarian NGOs who he knows will give him $1 million to say those things. So base and superstructure is a good way to explain a lot of things, but Peterson is a perfect example of what the capitalist education system is like and how it reinforces and conditions the capitalist relations of production. So here we see in the superstructure, which is anything not connected to production, you have art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, and education. So these help shape and maintain the base, which is things related to production, things related to economics, tools, machines, factories, land, raw materials, but most importantly, the relations of production, the economic classes. So you have the dominant exploiting non-working class, the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, and then you have the working class, the proletarians, who are exploited by them. Those are the relations of production at the core of our system. That's how things are produced. The capitalists organize and administrate production and appropriate, take home the surplus created by production, and the workers go in and work. The only commodity they have to sell is their labor power. And under capitalism, you have to sell a commodity to survive. And these relations of production, because they allow, the Koch brothers and all their buddies in the ruling capitalist class to accumulate tons of wealth and spend that money on NGOs and influencing various academics and, influencing the media and pushing their ideas, the education system is shaped by the relations of production. And then, because you have bourgeois ideologues pushing capitalist ideology, pushing an ideology and pushing education that reinforces these relations of production, they help maintain and shape the base, the economic base. So because our economic base is based on relations of production where the capitalist class is dominant, when you search communism on YouTube, the first thing that comes up is Jordan Peterson talking about how communism's evil and how it could never work, with a bunch of nonsense ahistorical evidence to back up his theory. But yeah, that's just part of the capitalist superstructure. It's the capitalist superstructure revealing itself. Yeah, shout out to Jordan Peterson for being terrible. That might have been worse than his video with Yeonmi Park, y'all. That might have seriously been worse than his video about the DPRK. Also, he said communism's a utopia again. I can't fucking do it with these people anymore. I can't do it. Stop saying communism's a utopia. This book is not long. This book is, I don't even know if it has page numbers. I counted them once. They're like 80 pages. Okay, I know this is more scholarly work. This is more research than you've ever done in your academic career, Jordan Peterson. Right? So this is going to be pretty hard. But read this. Set down Gulag Archipelago or set down the Black Book of Communism statistics that you Googled before your speech and read this. Right? Set down the Communist Manifesto, which is the only Marxist work that you've ever read. And then you think you understand it all because, like I said, you're arrogant and delusional, like you accuse other people of being. But just read this, open your mind, do some actual scholarly work for once, and research what's in this book. It is Engels criticizing the utopian socialists, people who thought we could enact a utopia. He's directly criticizing them and saying, no, we need class struggle, which will lead to the construction of a new system out of the wreckage of the old system. So we need to take capitalism as it exists, look at the classes within capitalism, have the exploited classes rise up. But once they do rise up, we can't just go to a utopia. That's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. We need to construct socialism slowly over time using what we already have, using the conditions that capitalism has created. And capitalism increases humans' productive capacity a great deal, creating the possibility, creating the conditions which make socialism realizable, which makes socialism possible. This is the idea of scientific socialism. And that never, ever, 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 ever in Marx or Engels' work at any point will you see them saying that we can create a utopia, right? Not only can we not create a utopia overnight, not only do we need to construct socialism out of our current system, but we'll never reach a utopia. It doesn't make sense. You know, you could always stub your toe under communism and be like, ow, you know, I guess this world isn't perfect. I guess it's not a utopia. Like, of course, there's no utopia. I think Marx and Engels were so stupid that they believed that. The only reason you think that is because you've never actually read them, because you're a fraud, Jordan Peterson. You are an academic fraud. You're like the guy in wrestling who gets pinned every time he goes out there to wrestle and who leaves practice every day because he has a boo-boo and he's crying or because he's tired. And then talks shit about how you're the man. Talks about how, you know, I totally would have beat that guy if, you know, I didn't stub my toe. You just make excuses for yourself. Peterson thinks he's got it all figured out. He thinks he has this great grasp on history, and anybody who disagrees with him is simply delusional and arrogant, when he's the delusional and arrogant one. So it's kind of how psychological projection works. Or use the audiobook. They're everywhere these days. LOL. Yeah, seriously. On the way to your next speaking engagement, Jordan Peterson, listen to Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific on audiobook. I know that it's going to ruin your whole presentation. You're going to be like, I can't give this speech because I just figured out I'm wrong about everything after reading this short pamphlet. But it'll be worth it. You don't want to keep running around sounding like an idiot. That's the legacy you're going to leave on this earth. You don't want it to be like that.